So welcome back to the Floriani Software Fundamentals video series on FTCU. My name is Mark Garetz and I'm a National Floriani educator. And in this section, we're going to be talking all about working with text. So before we get into working with text in the software, we need to take a few minutes and talk about the various types of text that there are, especially as it relates to embroidery software. So there are basically three types of text. There are fonts that are built into the software, and that's what we're going to be dealing with mostly, is using the built-in fonts. However, those are stitch files, and they are made specifically to stitch out in certain ways. So they are not general purpose fonts. They are specific not only to the software, but they are also specific to embroidery designs. In the world of computers, there's another type of font called a TrueType font, and those are the fonts that come with Windows, and you can also buy or download many hundreds of thousands of different TrueType fonts. And when you use Word or you use PowerPoint or Excel or any other kind of a Windows program, the text or fonts that you are using in that program are TrueType fonts. So you probably know about Arial and Times New Roman and things like that. Those are TrueType fonts. And then the third type of font isn't actually a font at all. Those are fonts that you buy from an embroidery design company, and they are actually files that look like letters, but they are actually just an embroidery file. So for example, there might be a file that looks like a capital letter A, another file that looks like a small letter A, another file that looks like a capital letter B, etc. So in order to actually use those to make words, you would have to bring each one of those files in independently and put them together manually using a layout, like we just talked about, to produce an embroidery design that looks like you typed it in, but there's not actually a way that you can type it in, except for we've just added a brand new feature that lets you do that, and that's called the font importer, and we'll get to that a bit later in this section. So again, to review, those are the three different types of fonts. We have the built-in embroidery fonts that come with the software. We have TrueType fonts. Those are the Windows fonts. And then we have the embroidery files that look like fonts that you can bring in, import into the software, and basically turn them in to something very similar to a built-in font that you can then type with a keyboard. I guess the fourth type of font we should talk a little bit about are monograms, and again, those are a different kind of version of the built-in fonts. So again, those are things that are designed to stitch out right from the get-go, and they're built into the software, but they have some different properties and they're designed to work well as monograms. So let's get into fonts. Most of your font controls are all right here. Okay, so we've got our normal text, which is our built-in fonts. We have our monogram fonts, which are our built-in monograms. This is our font importer that we just talked about to let you bring in those embroidery files. This is one way that you can bring in a TrueType font, and TTF, when you see it, that stands for TrueType font. And this last one is a brand new feature that we just added called Font Play. And Font Play is a really cool way to preview the fonts that you want to use in the software. So we'll be talking about all of those in this section. So what we're going to concentrate on right now is the built-in fonts. So when you hover over this T or you click on it, what you're going to get is a little drop down, and you're going to get another T that looks just like this one, and this is your normal text mode. We also have text on a circle, we have text on a vertical line, and text on a path, which lets you make the text flow along any path that you want. So we're going to start out using normal text. So when I click that, what's going to happen is my icon is going to change from a normal cursor into what looks like the normal cursor, but notice that it's got an A by it to remind us that we're in text mode. And also notice that there's a little asterisk by the A. What that asterisk means is that if I click now, I am going to put in a new line of text. If that asterisk wasn't there, that would mean I would be selecting text that already existed. So we'll see how that works when we get some text in here. So I'm just going to go ahead and click, and it's going to put in some text in the last font that I used, and it happens to be Anna. And I can tell that it's Anna because it says Anna right over here in my properties box. And it always puts in the words my text because everybody always wants to stitch out my text, right? That was actually a little bit of a joke, but this is actually just a placeholder for where you're going to put your own text in. And the way you're going to do that is in this little properties box over here, you are going to type in whatever text that you want. So you could put in whatever text you wanted over this, all right? So if I want to put in my name, I can come in here and I can, for example, type in Mark, and I can click apply, and now I will have the word Mark in here. And let me double click my magnifying glass to zoom in so you can see what's going on. And this font is Anna, and you can see all of the stitches that make up this font. If I turn it into 3D mode, you'll see that it's actually a very, very nice font, but it's blown way, way up. So if I look at it again, one to one, I will see that it looks like a nice satin stitch font. And that's pretty much the default for the built-in fonts, is they are satin stitches. So let me zoom in here again, and I'm going to turn off 3D mode, and let's take a look at some of the controls over here in my font window. So first of all, what I've got here is a little preview of the fonts, and you can see when I hover over it, I get a little pop-up that comes up, but it only stays up for a little bit of time. And so let me go back and let me hover over it again, and you can see this is showing me all of the characters that are in this font, along with the, whoops, went away again, hold on, the recommended minimum and maximum heights in inches and millimeters that you should stitch this out. Now you'll notice that that gets fairly annoying, that it keeps going away if I want to examine that screen. So we give you a way to bring it up and leave it there, and that's what this little question mark icon right here. If you click that, you'll get a window showing you all of that same information, but now it's going to stay there until you either click OK or click the little X. So you can see that I've got all of the characters in here, my recommended minimum and maximum heights. Now you can go inside or outside these dimensions and you can still stitch it out, but we recommend that you stay within these recommended minimum and maximum heights for best results. Now let's talk about the character sets for a minute, because this is very important. Not every character of the built-in font, or I should say not every built-in font has every single character available. So for example, if we were working with a headline font, that typically doesn't have lowercase letters. Similarly, an athletic style font typically doesn't have lowercase letters. It always is going to have numbers, but it probably won't have any punctuation or any foreign characters or anything like that, because it's a very simple athletic font. So it's very important when you start typing something that you look here to see if those characters exist, because if they don't, the software is just going to skip right over them. It's not going to give you an error message or anything. So let me give you an example that comes up in the real world. So for example, if I was putting in a recipe towel and I had called for 1/4 cup of sugar in this chocolate chip cookie recipe, and to put in 1/4 cup, I would type a 1, a slash, and a 4. So my slash is right here, so I can see that if I used Anna, that would be fine. But if I used a font that didn't have a slash, and I didn't notice that anything was weird, my recipe would now call for 14 cups of sugar instead of 1/4 cup of sugar, and that probably wouldn't make a very good cookie. So you got to be very careful when you're putting in complicated text that you look and make sure that all the characters that you need are in that font. So I'm going to go ahead and close that window out, and let's go ahead and look at some of the other controls here. So going back to the text box here where you put in your text, it's not necessary to actually always type the text in here. You can actually copy and paste text in here. So if I had some text on my clipboard, say I copied it out of Word, I could right click in here and select paste, and it would put that text in. Now let's move over here to the preview window. And again, we talked about if you hover over it, you're going to get a quick little preview of what's in there. But this also gives you an indication of what the font is going to look like In addition, it gives you a quick heads up that this font has upper and lowercase letters. So for example, this particular font, which is Anna, which I select right here, we'll come to that in a second, it's got upper and lowercase letters because I can see capital ABC, lower ABC, lowercase ABC. So if I click this down arrow, this is how I would select a different font. And if I want to see what's in here, I can hover over these, and if I move my mouse down, you can see that I get a quick preview of what all these fonts are. So you can see that most of these have upper and lowercase letters. When I come down here to Circus, you'll see that that one has A, B, C, D, E, F in all uppercase. That's a big indication that this font has no lowercase letters. Now, while we're in this window, let's just take a look at what's going on here. Because when I get down to the bottom, I can't continue on unless I scroll down. Okay, so I can scroll down this way, I can put coiled at the top, and then I can continue to look at my fonts like that. But I can also use my up arrow and down arrow on my keyboard. So if I hold my down arrow down, or I just click it, I'm clicking that one at a time, when I get down to the bottom, if I click again, it does let me scroll one font at a time. And if I know, for example, the font that I'm looking at starts with an S, I can simply type the S key on my keyboard, and I go right to the first set of fonts that start with an S. All right, and then I can scroll more to see the fonts that I'm looking for. The other way you can select the fonts is with this control right here. So before we talk about that, let's take a look at what's going on in front of some of these fonts. So you'll notice that some of the fonts have letters in front of them or numbers, like this one says 60, this one says SC, this one says BL, this one has an orange O, etc. And here's an HW. So what do those mean? All right, well, they are indicators of what this type of font is. So BL means a block font. 60 means you should stitch that out with 60 weight thread, which is a finer weight thread, meaning this is a small font. You'll also notice the small fonts tend to have the millimeters that they're designed to stitch out at right in the name. And SC is a script font. HW is a handwritten font. And this last one down here, this one that says test, this is one that I added, and it is got a little outline F, and that says that it was a font that I added with the font importers. Ready. So one of the coolest things that we just added is this new feature right here, and that is the font filter. So this is a way that we can look at fonts that have these prefixes by them, so we don't have to sort through all the other fonts. So for example, if I know I want a nice bold font like a block font, I can click that, and now when I click my drop down, I will only see those bold fonts or block fonts. So that's how that one works. And if I want to change, say for example, I want to see all the handwritten fonts, I can click the down arrow. Now I see all the ones that have HW in the front. So that is a cool new feature that we added, and it's called the font filter. If I go back to all fonts, I will see all the fonts in my list. And we'll come back to some of the specialty features of some of these fonts. Before we do that, we're going to talk about the rest of the controls in here. So the height control, this is right now showing in inches because I happen to be in inches mode over here. If I change to metric mode, you'll see that this changes to millimeters. All right, so I'm going to go back to inches, and you can see that it's actually 0.79 inches high, which is the default for this particular font. And if I want to change this value, I can type in a new value. And this height control changes the height of the tallest letter, and it changes the width of the text proportionally. So it keeps the shape of the letters perfect. So for example, if I change this to 0.6 and click apply, then my text is going to get smaller, but everything is going to stay perfect. Now, if I wanted to stretch this text out to where the text actually got wider but didn't get any taller, that's what I do with my width control. So before we adjust anything with width, width is always going to be 100% as it relates to the height. So if I change this to something below 100%, the text is going to get squished. If I change it something bigger than that, it's going to get stretched out. Now, we're not talking about the spacing between the characters. We're talking about the characters themselves. So watch, for example, what happens if I put in 120% and click apply. The height is going to stay the same, but the characters get stretched out a little bit. All right. Similarly, if I were to go to 80% of the height, then they would get apparently taller, but they're just actually skinnier. They really didn't change their height. So I'm going to go back to 100% and click apply, because I want to talk to you now about the line, or excuse me, because I want to talk to you now about the spacing control. Now, this does change the space between the characters without changing what the characters look like at all. So that's going to put an even amount of space between each character. Now, this is not an actual measurement or anything. This is just an arbitrary number. So sometimes little numbers make a big change, and it depends a little bit on the height that you're working with. So let's try putting in a spacing of 3 and see what happens. And you can see that spread those characters out quite a bit. And if I put in a spacing of a minus number, it's actually going to squish them together. So if I put in -3, I actually get them so close that they start stitching out on top of each other. Probably not what I want to do. So let me go back to the default of 0 and click apply. This next control right here, the line spacing, this really has no meaning unless we have more than one line. So we'll come back to that in a second. But I do want to show you this control right here, and I'm skipping over this alignment control because, again, this doesn't do anything unless we have more than one line of text. But I want to show you the slant control, because that actually slants the characters over either to the left or the right, so you can have italics made out of any character that you want. So if I put a positive number in here, and the values can go between 0 and 60, it's actually the angle that this will slant over at. And if I put a minus number in, it'll slant backwards. So let me move my text a little bit into the center of the screen here so you can see this a little bit better. If I put in, say, 25-degree angle and press apply, they will lean over to the left at a 25-degree angle. If I put in a -25 and click apply, they will lean over the other way. And again, of course, if I put in a 0 and click apply, they will be back at a straight up and down. Now, some fonts are automatically slanted the way they come in, but you can slant them further if you need to using this slant control. So it's a nice way to be able to add italics to any font that you want. Now let's add in another line of text. So I'm going to come up to my text box and I'm going to click on it, and I'm going to show you a common mistake that happens because I see this a lot in the classes that I teach. If you put in the word mark like I've done here, and then like you are used to on, say, a typewriter, you put in the enter button or return or whatever you call it. So you see my cursor is flashing on the line below mark. I've actually just put in another line of text. Now there's nothing on it, all right, but it still thinks of it as a line of text. So if you look right now, you'll see that I've got my text controls hugging this text. But if I click apply now, you will see that. And if I double click so you can see it all on the screen, oops, that was not good. Let me zoom out. Let me zoom out a little bit more. You'll see that I've got a bounding box here that actually goes way outside the text. So if you see this, it's actually an indication that you've got an extra blank line in there or something like that. So what you want to do is come into your text box, click anywhere, and it usually goes right back to the very end. And if you backspace, it'll delete that extra carriage return, and you can click apply, and now your box will be hugging the text. So let's go ahead and put in another line of text. So I'm going to click in my text box. Now I'm going to intentionally put in another line by pressing enter. I'm going to put in my last name below, and I'm going to click apply. Because now we've got 2 lines of text on here, and I'll double click that to make it a little bit bigger. So you can see there's my name in nice big letters on the screen. And you can tell if you look at this that this text is centered. So it's what we call center aligned. So the Mark and the Garetz are centered with respect to each other instead of being aligned to the left or the right. If I want it to look like a normal paragraph, that would be a left align. So I would come here to my alignment control, and I would click the down arrow, and I would choose left, and I would click apply, and now it's aligned on the left. If I wanted to make it be on the right, I would click right and click apply, and now it would be aligned over here on the right. So that's what this particular control does right here, your alignment control. Now, if I take the word Garetz out of there and I backspace one more time to get rid of the blank line and click apply, it really doesn't matter what this is set to if there's only one line of text. Whether it's right, left, or center, it won't matter. So watch, I'll change it back to the default of center and click apply, and you see that nothing happens. All right, so I am going to talk now about one other set of controls over here that we didn't talk about, and that is this style box right here. Now you will notice that right now this style box is grayed out. That's because this font, Anna, has no styles. If I click the down arrow, you'll see that some of the fonts have a little orange O by them, and those are what we call outline fonts. So the O actually stands for outline, but I kind of like to think of it as standing for options because it means there's other styles that I can apply to this text. So let me just select breezy, and you'll see now that my style box lit up. So let me just click apply so you can see what breezy looks like, and let me double click to get that back on the screen, and you'll see that that's kind of a script font. And if I change my style now, you can see that I've got various styles. So I've got a run style, a satin style, an applique, and a default with run. So let's talk about what these do. So the default is basically a satin stitch. A run stitch is a run outline. So if I click that and I click apply, you'll see that it makes an outline of that font. So if I were to stitch this out, what I would have is a run stitch that just goes around the outline. Now you might think that satin would be the same as default, but in fact satin means I'm going to create a satin outline. Now technically that's called a steel stitch. When we get to stitches, we'll talk about that. But if I click satin and click apply, you'll see that I have this satin outline. Now that looks pretty awful because my font's really tiny. It's only 3/4 of an inch high. So if I were to make it, say, I don't know, let's make it 2 inches high and click apply, and I will double click my zoom tool so you can see it. Now that looks a lot better as a satin outline. And you'll notice that in my properties box here I have a steel stitch now. Remember I said that was technically a steel stitch? So this appeared because I chose satin here. So if I click this, this allows me to change the width and the density of that steel stitch. So if I wanted to change it so that it's a little bit tighter, so let me change it to a width of 2 and click apply. You can see that starts to look a little bit better as a run stitch outline font. Let's go back to our styles because there's a few more that I want to show you. And one of those is an applique. And if I click that, what I'm going to get is it resized it for me back to 0.79, which is the default. Let me make it back to 2. What I'm going to get here is an outline, or excuse me, an applique font. Now, at first glance, this looks an awful lot like the steel stitch font that we just looked at, or the satin stitch outline font. And in reality, it is. But what we've also got in here that you can't see is I actually have added a tack down line and a placement line to these characters. And you can see that over here in the applique tab. So you can see here I've got control over my applique type, my tack down, my finish, and other things like that, my corner type and all those things. I can even put fabric in, and we'll talk about that when we get to appliques. But let's go back to our normal text, and I want to show you the last option, and that is default with run. So what that does is it actually, and let me zoom in so we can see what that looks like, that actually takes your default satin stitch and adds a run outline to it. If I turn to 3D, I don't know how well you'll be able to see that. No, not too well. I apologize for that. Oh, if I click off it, maybe it will look better. So let me just click off it. Oh yeah, there you go. So you can now see the run stitch running around the outline of that font. So I'm going to reselect my text here, and I'm going to go back to just the default style, and let me go back to Anna because that's a little more pleasing font to look at. And I'm going to go ahead and click apply, and we've got our normal text back again. So that's pretty much all the controls that you can do in here, with the exception of this box right here, the True Type Font Selector. Now we're going to come back to that because before we do that, I want to show you a few extra things in here. So one of these tabs is called Text Extra, and if I click that, this allows me to change my sewing sequence, whether or not I want trims, and what types of locks I want, and whether I want to do something called auto color the characters. Right? So let's take a look at the sew sequence. What the sew sequence does is it allows me to sew from left to right, right to left, or center out. Now most of the time you're just going to sew from left to right, but if you sew center out, that's what you want to do for caps, because caps want to sew the text from the center out to keep the fabric from bunching up underneath the text. Trim type is important because if you have a machine like a multi-needle machine that responds to commands that say trim in the file, and remember that most home machines don't do that, so what you set this to won't have any effect, always says it's going to trim between each character. My other options are never, which means it's never going to trim, so it would depend in that case if it never trimmed on the internal logic of the machine to trim. So again, if you have most home machines, whatever you set this to, it won't matter. And then if you select auto, what that's going to mean is that it will basically trim between each word, okay, unless you make the words really close together, in which case it's not going to trim. Now, should you have a machine that does support trims, the best way to use text is with auto. Now, when you're a new embroiderer, you might think you want the machine to trim between each character, and in general, you don't want to, because I'm going to explain something a little technical to you here, and that's because our software uses something that we call closest point connect when it uses the built-in fonts. And what that means is that in the old days, fonts always connected along the bottom, no matter what letter it was. And a lot of software still does that. It still connects all your letters across the bottom. But that may not be the best way to do it, because in the commercial world, and when you get more experienced as a home embroiderer, you're going to understand that you want to avoid trims as much as possible. So most lettering that you'll find out in the real world, it doesn't have every little jump stitch between every character trimmed. Most of the time that little piece of thread is there, and we tend just to ignore it. Our brains don't see it. So as a exercise, go to a department store and look at some embroidery that's got text words in it, and you'll see the little jump stitches in between the characters. But what Floriani software does with the built-in fonts is it tries to connect each character to the closest point in the next character. So for example, if we connected across this M to the very bottom of this A, it would have this length of a stitch right here. A better way to do it is to connect right here where it's close together. This between the A and the R really probably doesn't matter, but between the R and the K, that's pretty obvious. So if we connected across the bottom, it would have a nice long stitch here, but if we connected here between the top of the R and the side of the K, that would have a much, much shorter stitch. So if you set your trim type to auto, then you are not going to get all of these trims in between each character and sort of undo all the closest point connect work that we've done for you. Now, lock stitch chooses whether you get a lock stitch never, always, or just around the trims. And generally, you probably want to select just around the trims, right? And then the last thing is this auto colors character. And this is just kind of a little fun feature that you can do. So if I click this and click apply and click off it, you'll see that each character now came out in a different color. Now, you can use this to get different colors, or if you have a machine that doesn't trim between each character on command and you want to force it to trim, you can select auto color characters and it'll think this is a new thread color, so it's going to stop, trim the thread, and ask you to put in a new thread spool. You don't, of course, put in a new thread spool, you just press start again, but that would put the trims in if they really want to do that. And I'm going to undo that by clicking my, oops, I just did something bad. Hold on a second. And I am going to reselect my text, and I'm going to come back to my text extra, and I'm going to turn off auto color and click apply. All right, so I'm going to reselect my text, and I'm going to come back to my text extra tab, and I'm going to turn off auto color characters and click apply because I don't want those characters to be different colors. All right, so going on with the other things that are going on in the properties box here, if I go to my fill tab, you'll see that I've got a standard fill pattern of a satin. So this is a little bit misleading because this really isn't a fill. It's really a satin stitch, but since it's got that satin pattern, this is going to treat it like a satin stitch. What is nice about this is that I can change from a satin into a fill pattern. So one of the things that we haven't talked about is that when you create a satin stitch, you want to keep your satin stitches no bigger than about 10 millimeters. That's the absolute maximum size. And as a practical matter, 7 is a really good target. I hardly ever will make a satin stitch above 7 millimeters. So if I make these stitches way bigger, I will get satin stitches that are too long. And I'm going to show you what happens when you do that. So if I come back here to my text tab where I've got my height control, and I want to make these characters really big, like let's say I want to make them 3 inches tall, and I click apply, a warning is going to come up that says you have created satin segments whose width exceeds the recommended maximum stitch of 10 millimeters. As a result, you may experience difficulty when sewing this design, etc. So it says it's advisable that we resize the satin segments to achieve a width smaller than 10. So we could resize the satin segments, but that would mean making our font too small. So I'm going to click OK. Now, if you don't want to be bothered by this warning, you can check this box here to keep it from annoying you if you know what you're doing. But most of the time, you want to leave this warning on. And if you should turn it off and you decide you want it to come back on, I'll show you a lot later in another section how to get this warning to come back. But I'm going to go ahead and click OK because I want to create these satin segments that are way too big on purpose. All right, so I've got my ruler tool right here, and we haven't talked about this yet, but this is a way to measure a stitch segment or any other part of your design to see what the length is. So let me double click out so I can try and find one of the biggest satin stitches, and I think my biggest satin stitch is probably right here across the M, or maybe actually in here across the A. So let me grab my ruler, and what happens is if I click and drag this ruler across in the direction of those stitches, you'll see it says it's 0.6 inches. Now, I usually measure my satins in millimeters, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to change to metric mode, and I'm going to repeat that because now it's going to show me in metric. So you can see that's 14.8 millimeters. That's way, way bigger than I should make a satin stitch. Now your machine might not physically actually make that stitch. It might say this is a jump stitch, and you're going to get missing stitches in here and all kinds of trims and stuff because it thinks this should have been a trim or a jump rather than a actual stitch. If your machine actually would stitch this, you still wouldn't want to do it because this thread would be so long that it would flop all around. But you'll notice that my little tip says I should be using a fill here. And we'll talk more about this magic ruler when we get to digitizing, but it's telling me I ought to be using a fill. Let's just try one of the shorter satin stitches, and that one is even way outside where I want to be, and it says use a fill. So I really want to be using fill stitches for this particular font right now at this size. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to my fill tab, and instead of using a satin style, I could change to a fill pattern. And we talked about these fill patterns before. So for example, I could change to pattern 1, which is also known as a tatami fill. So this is your pretty standard fill. I'd say about 95% of the fills that you find out there are this pattern 1 or tatami fill. So if I click that and click apply, you will see that I will get a fill stitch in here now, and I've got no warning. So if I wanted to stitch this font out this big, I wouldn't want to use a satin stitch. I would want to convert to a fill stitch, and of course you can change to whatever pattern that you want. Now the next tab here, this is your underlay tab. So this lets you adjust the underlay for your text, and we haven't actually talked about underlay yet, but we'll get to that. And then lastly, we have push and pull compensation, and we haven't talked about that at all either, but we will get to that in another section. So I've gone back to normal text over here, and we've talked about everything in this properties box with the exception of the line spacing control. So let's talk about that now. As I mentioned earlier, the line spacing, just like this alignment, doesn't do anything unless you have more than one line of text. So let's add in another line of text. I'm just going to use my last name again in here, and I'm going to click apply and double click my magnifying glass so you can see everything. And what the line spacing control does is what you think it might do. Controls the spacing between the lines of text, and it's a percentage. And it's a percentage of this value here. So it's going to be 25% of 0.79 inches. And this height, by the way, is the tallest capital letter, if I didn't mention that earlier. So you might be used to, in your word processor, controlling the spacing between the lines by putting in a blank line. So in other words, pressing enter and then pressing enter again and putting in another line of text. And a lot of us still do that. But that's not the best way to do it. You get finer control over this by putting in a line spacing number. So I can put in a bigger number or a smaller number. So if I wanted to spread this text apart, I could say maybe double it to 50% and click apply. And you will see that I've got more spacing between the lines. If I wanted them tighter, I could maybe put in 15% and click apply, and that would snuggie them up a little bit better, closer together. So depending on the effect that you want and how much text you need to put in a certain space, you can adjust your line spacing. And I'm going to go back to 25%. In fact, I'm going to take out the second line of text here and click apply. So we just have that one word on the screen. And I'm actually going to zoom out a little bit because what I want to talk to you about now is a handier way, other than using the numeric controls over here to control your text properties, to do it visually. Now you will notice that when we've been working with text that they have different kinds of dots and symbols around it than we had in our normal selection mode. And that's because what we're in right now is text selection mode. I can tell I'm in text selection mode because my cursor has an A by it, and my T is highlighted here in orange. My normal select tool is not. If I click my normal select tool, I'll select that text in normal select mode, and I can do all the normal selection things with it, but you'll notice that all my little extra controls went away. So if I go back and reselect text mode, you'll see all my little controls come back, and we're going to take a look at what those do right now. So the first one I want to talk to you about is this one right here. It looks like a little house, and the little roof of the house is pointing up, and if I hover my mouse over it, you'll see that it changes to a crosshair, telling me that if I click and drag now, I can use this control. And what this control is exactly the same as the height control over here, except it's a visual way to control the height rather than a numeric way. So if I click and drag, I will get bigger characters, and again they're going to change proportionally. And if I click and drag down, I will get smaller characters. Again, you'll notice that my height changed from its original value. So it's exactly the same control, just a visual way of doing it. So we're going to move down to the lower right hand corner here, the same little house, but this time pointing out to the right, and this control is the same as our width control. So this allows me to expand or contract the text using the width control, but do it visually instead of numerically. So if you see I make it wider, you see now I'm at 118%. If I go the other way, if I make it skinnier, you can see now I'm at 77.5%. So let me go back to 100. All right, and I'm doing that by typing it in, or I could just simply use the undo button. So either way I wanted to do it. So those are some real useful controls. Again, your height control, your width control. Now what I want to talk to you about is this blue dot right here. Now this blue dot works the same as the blue dot did in our regular selection box. So this lets me rotate. So if I hover over it, you'll see I get a rotate icon, and if I click and drag, I can rotate the text anywhere I want. I'm going to undo that. And this last corner down here, the black diamond, that's actually the same as my slant control. So if I click and drag that to the left, the characters will slant over to the left. If I click and drag it to the right, they will slant over to the right. And you'll see that the slant value changes over here as a result. So if I want to put it back to straight up and down, I can type in a 0 and click apply, and now my characters are straight up and down again. Now the other controls I want to talk to you about are the little dots that are in the center here. And there's a orange square and there's a blue diamond. And they do different things. If I click the orange square, that lets me take control over just the character that it's in the center of. So you see each character has its own orange square. So if I just took control over the M, if I wanted to take control over the A, I could click that. And what I've got is something like a little shortcut bounding box. So I've got boxes in the center and dots on the side. So these are resize controls, and all I have is a proportional resize here. I don't have the ability to squish it, but I can also rotate it. So if I wanted to make this A bigger, for example, and I wanted to rotate it, I could. I could even, using the center dot, if I hover over the center, it's a quad-headed arrow, I can actually move this A wherever I want to, and it's still part of this stitch sequence. I probably don't want to do that. So I'm going to undo all of those things that I did, but I just wanted to show you how that worked. Now, the other control are these blue diamonds, and these are very, very useful. Now, the technical name for them is the kerning control, and that's a typesetting term meaning the spacing between the characters. So this lets me move the characters closer together or further apart. But the way it works is, in between each character, I've got a blue diamond. So you can see I've only got 3 blue diamonds here, because that's the only in-betweens I have. There's no in-between the K and blank, and there's no in-between the M and blank. So only between the A and the R and the K and the M have I got these. So if I click and drag this A over, you can see that it moves everything to the right with it. All right, so let's say I wanted more spacing. Let me actually undo that. If I wanted more spacing between the K and the R, let's say I wanted this out here for some reason like that. And then I decided I needed less spacing over here. If I drag this A over, you'll notice that it tightens this up, but it did not change whatever I did over here. So this is really, really useful for adjusting characters. And where you're really going to use this a lot is with script fonts. So let me change this to a script font. And this font that I'm going to use is a script font that I like down here called Symphony. So I'm going to select that one and click Apply. And I've got the same characters, and they're pretty much all connected here except between the M and the A. And the reason that I've got that disconnect here is because this M leans way over, and the software wants to draw a square box around it when it mathematically figures out where they go. But visually, it's in the wrong place. Now, I could move the A over and get it lined up, but I have two issues when I do that. Number one, obviously, I made a problem between the A and the R, so I would have to move the R over and then the K over, etc. But I also, if I'm not careful, I could actually misalign this A off the baseline. So I did that kind of on purpose. So I'm going to undo both of those changes because the blue diamonds is a much, much better way to do it. And that is if I click here and drag over, you'll see that it's easy to align that text, and it took everything over here and you didn't notice it, but there's no way if I drag up or down that I can move that text off the baseline. So that's a really, really cool way to adjust your character spacing with the little diamonds here. Now I'm going to change back to Anna. So I'm going to go back up here to Anna and click Apply because I want to show you one other thing, and that is something we call the text envelopes. Now you'll notice that my bounding box around this text doesn't look like the normal bounding box. Not only do I have different controls, but instead of being a solid black line, it's a dashed black line. And that's because this really isn't a bounding box at all. This is what we call a text envelope. So the characters are going to draw themselves within this rectangle, and a rectangle is the standard envelope that all text goes into, or at least most text. But it doesn't mean I have to keep that. The corner controls, which look like little black boxes, they let me stretch this edge or this edge of the envelope either up or down. So for example, if I wanted to create a pennant effect, I could make this one taller, and I could make this one taller on that side, and maybe I want to actually make these skinnier. All right, and so now I've got a pennant effect, and I'm going to undo all of those changes to go back to normal text, because the ones I want to show you now are some of my favorites, and that these little dots here in the center. And I like to call these the text warping controls. I'm not exactly sure what the technical name for them is, but they let you put a bend in the envelope right here at the center. So you can bend in or bend out. So let me just show you bending in. So you can see I can bend it in. I could bend this one in to get what we call a bridge effect, and I could make them bridge like this. Okay, so I can do any kind of effects like that. Now I'm going to show you another thing that happens when you right click here. If I right click, I've got a nice little menu, and one of those is my envelope control, so I can actually change my envelope using these presets. All right, I can also reset the frame if I don't like anything. So if I click reset the frame, it's going to go back to normal text. If I right click on it again, I can go to my envelope. If I want to do that double concave bridge like I just showed you, I can click that and it will do that as a preset. Now if I wanted a little bit less or a little bit more, I can still further adjust it from here. So I can make it a little bit like that if I wanted to do that. All right, but I'm going to reset that frame. All right. Now I want to talk to you about something that people get confused about a lot, because when you are in text mode, and again we tell we're in text mode because we have the little A by our cursor and our T is lit up, you will see all these extra text controls. If you are in normal mode, you won't see those controls. And if you wonder where they went, it's because you are not in text mode. So to get back to text mode, all you do is click the T and then the T again, and you'll be back in text mode. So earlier on, we talked about whether this text cursor had an A or an A with an asterisk. And right now you can see it has just an A, and that's because I've got my text selected. If I were to click off it now, you'll see that the asterisk reappears. That's because it's telling me if I click now, I'm going to put in new text. But if I want to edit this text, I want to select that text. As I get close to this text, you'll see that the asterisk disappears. So what that means is I'm close enough to this now that if I click, I will reselect this text rather than putting in new text. So that's what that little asterisk means. Again, if I click off it, you'll see now that I've got the asterisk. So if I click now, it's going to put in my text again. I'm going to undo that because I don't want another my text in there. But if I hover close to this, you'll see the asterisk goes away. And if I click that, it reselects the text. So that covers the basics of the built-in fonts in normal text mode. In our next section, we'll get into monograms and our other text modes like text on a circle, etc.